All right, so we're going to talk about solving rational equations. This is the lesson for 5.3. Okay, so what we're doing is we're giving here now, we're taking these rational equations and we're setting them equal to 0 so we can solve. We do the same thing as far as getting a common denominator. So we kind of worked on finding common denominators on our last lesson. So same thing. So let's just kind of get started on this. So the first thing we want to do here is we want to factor this out. So notice that a greatest common factor here is an x. So let's take an x out. Okay. And then here we have a greatest common factor of x as well. So let's take an x out there. X divided by x. Okay. So this is what we're going to be using. So to find the common denominator, the least common denominator, we're going to take the most that each term has. So here, let's start here. We have an x minus 2. Okay, we have an x here, which we've already shown, and an x minus 1. So if this one happened to be an x squared, I would take the one that has the most. So I would have used an x squared here. All right, so what I want is I want this denominator right here to be the same as this. So when I just look at this right here, what am I missing here that I need to make to get this? Well, I need to multiply this by an x minus 1. Would you agree? So if I take that times an x minus 1, then that's the same denominator that I have here. But what I do here, I need to also do to the top. So I have to multiply this times 2x minus 1. I'm sorry, times x minus 1. Now let's distribute that 2 through. So we would have a 2x, 2 times a negative 1. Now let's look at this one. So here's our denominator, and I need it to look like this. So what do I have to multiply this by for it to look like this? Well, what I'm missing is the x minus 2. So I have to multiply times an x minus 2. Well, that means I have to multiply my numerator also by an x minus 2. So distribute this. Now keep in mind the sign. So this is a negative 3 that you distribute through. So a negative 3 times x and a negative 3 times a negative 2. So let's go ahead and simplify like terms. So positive 2x and negative 3x is a negative 1x. So we end up with a negative x. Negative 2 plus 6 is a positive 4. And then here's our denominator. And that's equal to 0. All right, so when I solve this, what I want to do is I want to solve this now for x. But what I have to do to get this out of the denominator is multiply both sides by this denominator. So if I do that over here, I'm going to kind of run out. I think it'd be kind of hard for me to write it over here. So I'll write it up here. X minus 2, and x minus 1. I'm going to take this times this, and then I also have to multiply this side times x minus 2 times x minus 1. So I have to multiply both sides by this denominator. Well, what happens over here is this whole denominator always cancels out. That's always going to happen. And then here, let me make that a little bit better, zoom in a little bit. There we go. 0 times anything is always just going to be 0. So what I end up with here, these cancel out, so I have a negative x plus 4 is equal to 0 times all of this, which is 0. So honestly, what happens is really you're just setting the numerator equal to 0. That's how it's always going to turn out on these. So now I still have to solve for x. So let's subtract 4. So we'd have negative x. Okay, we can't have a negative coefficient there, so we're going to divide or multiply by negative 1. And our answer here then is x equals a positive 4. All right, and you can check that by taking this answer and putting it back into the problem and see if it comes out to be correct, back to the original problem. I did want to point out, I forgot to say right here on the study notes, this was a 2x, so make that correction. It's just a minus x. That was an error on that. So you go back and check it. All right, so we'll go back and check this one. Let me get the original here. So it's going to be 2. So it will be 2 x squared. So we're going to put in a 4 minus 2. So what I'm doing is just putting a 4 in for this original. I just didn't have the original written down here. And then minus 3 over x squared minus x. So let's see what that gives us if we work that out. So this is going to be 2 over 16 minus 8, which is 8, 16 minus 8, minus 3 over 16 minus 4, which is 12. Okay, that's not a whole lot of fun. So let's put it into a common denominator of 24. 8 times 3 is 24, so 2 times 3 is 6. 12 times 2 is 24. So 3 times 2 is 6, and that equals 0. All right, so here is the answer. X is equal to 4. So I should be able to put 4 back into the original problem and it should equal 0, which it did. All right, I'm not going to check all of these because they take so much time, but you do need to check them to be sure that all of your solutions are correct. All right, so B, later we'll talk about extraneous solutions, but we're not going to talk about that too much quite yet. So, all right, so here's our next problem. Again, this is on your study guide. So let's get a least common denominator. So first of all, least common denominator is going to be the one that has the most. So I would go ahead and just maybe make that a fraction. Okay, so what do I have here as far as common denominators? I want the one with the most. So I could take x, but then I have an x squared here. So since this one has the most, that's the one I'm going to use. Now this 1 is automatically there. I just don't ever show it. So you don't really have to write that 1 there. All right, so now what I want to do is get everything into this common denominator. So here, what am I missing? This to get this. Well, I'm missing all of x squared. So I have to multiply this times x squared, which means I multiply the top times x squared. So 1 times x squared in the numerator is x squared. Okay, now let's look at this one. I have an x and I need an x squared. So what am I missing? Well, I have to multiply this times an x to get x squared. Multiply, then I have to also then multiply my numerator by that. So this is a negative, and this 3 times x. Okay, so here, what do I have to multiply this by? I have that denominator, so I don't have to multiply anything. I just write down the negative 10. All right, so let's go ahead and take this top part and let's factor this. So usually when we see that it's a quadratic, we're going to be able to factor that. So here we'll keep going, and so let's see what multiplies to equal 10, negative 10. Can I get 3? So we're going to split the x's, 5 and 2. Those multiply. We need a negative 3, so negative 5, positive 2. And that then also multiplies back together to be negative 10. All right, so now we have to get rid of this denominator. So just like we did up here, we're going to multiply both sides times x squared. So if I multiply this times x squared, these will cancel. And if I multiply this times x squared, that's 0. So again, recognize what I end up with is just my numerator equal to 0. So set each of these equal to 0, so x will equal 5 and x will equal a negative 2. And then I'd like to see you check both of those answers into the original problem to see if they come out to be 0, like we checked this one. All right, our next one . So here, now notice here we don't have, if we want to, a couple ways we can do this. We can subtract the 1 over here and just get a common denominator. So let's go ahead and do that. So let's go ahead and subtract 1. Now what you have to be careful of here is this you cannot do this right here, this operation, because this has a denominator. Okay, so you have to get a common denominator here. And a lot of students just try and take that as a 2 minus 1 and make it x plus 1. Okay, so here, common denominator. So let's get the common denominator. It's going to be, we have a 2x plus 1. And then we just have a 1, which is already in there, right? We have a 1. If I put a 1 on the outside, I don't really have to show that. So getting the common denominator, I already have it. So all I need to do is write down the numerator. I'll go ahead and put it in parentheses. You don't have to, but okay, minus. Okay, now what do I have to multiply this by to get this? We need to multiply it times a 2x plus 1. And I just think it's easier to keep that in parentheses. Well, that means I have to multiply the top here then by 2x plus 1. So I'm going to go ahead and leave, there's a negative on the outside, and then this is going to be 1 times this is a 2x plus 1. And then this is all set equal to 0. So we got a common denominator here, but now we got to distribute this negative through. Don't forget to do that. So let's start down here. We have an x plus 2. Now this is just like a negative 1. So a negative 1 times 2x, negative 2x, and negative 1 times a positive 1. All of this over 2x plus 1 equals 0. So multiply both sides by, oh, let's go ahead and get like terms on top here. So 1x and a negative 2x would be a negative 1x. Don't have to show the 1. 2 minus 1. All right. So once we're here, multiply both sides by 2x plus 1. But what that does is just have us set our numerator equal to 0. So here we have negative x equals a negative 1. Oh, sorry, running out of, sorry about that. And so divide by negative 1. So x is equal to a positive 1. Okay, and you can come back right here and check that. Put a 1 in, be 3. Put a 1 in, 2 plus 1 is 3, equals 1. That comes out to be true. All right. So again, remember, when we get here, multiply both sides by 2x plus 1. But what that really ends up doing is just taking the numerator equal to 0. Right? It's what we talked about here, and it's what we talked about up here. All right, so let's head down to D here. All right. So, oh, I'm sorry, we wrote this problem wrong. So the first thing we have to do is we're gonna have to look at this problem right here and factor this out. That's a difference of squares. So this is going to factor out to an x plus 2 and an x minus 2. So that's what we'll use. So let's get a common denominator here. So we have an x minus 2. I think it's easier to keep them in parentheses. We have an x plus 2. Okay, well this one has an x plus 2, x minus 2. We've already got it, so we don't have to write it again. All right, so let's look here to get the common denominator. What do I have to multiply this denominator by right here to get this? Well, I need an x plus 2. So if I multiply that times an x plus 2, then I have to multiply this times an x plus 2. So let's, hard to see, I'm sorry if that's kind of hard for you to, it's a little, try and get it focused in there a little bit better. That's about the best I can do. So x times x plus 2. So here we're going to take x times x is x squared plus x times 2 is 2x. All right, so here, what am I missing here? I'll go ahead and put it in parentheses. To get this, well, I'm missing an x minus 2. So let's multiply times an x minus 2. I'm going to leave myself a little more room, and an x minus 2. So this is just 1 times x, so that's just plus 1x. And then 1 times a negative 2 is a negative 2. And then equals, well, would you agree that I have the common denominator here? So it just is going to equal, let's go ahead and, actually, let's just go ahead and leave it on this side of the equal sign because I already have that denominator. So everything then has a common denominator. So, you know, there is a choice on, actually, let's just leave it like this. If I wanted to bring this over to this side, like I did here, and set it equal to 0, I can. I could have subtracted 8 and did that. I chose to just leave it on this side, and I could have done the same thing here. Sorry about that. So that's kind of an option you can choose. I can leave this over here, like I did with the 8, and just finish solving it. Or I can move this to the left side. I can subtract 1 from both sides and then get a common denominator. So I subtracted 1, set it equal to 0. It's entirely your choice on that. It works either way. So this one I did not decide to subtract 8 over, I just left it. So now my denominator is x plus 2 and x minus 2. So I'm going to multiply both sides. If I multiply this by an x plus 2, x minus 2, this disappears. If I multiply this times an x plus 2, x minus 2, this disappears. So I'm left with just whatever is in the numerator. Okay, so let's go ahead and combine like terms. You can combine like terms before you multiply by the denominator if you want to. I mean, there's some flexibility within that. So x squared, 2x plus 1x. Okay, so let's set it equal to 0. So we're going to subtract 8 from both sides. So if I subtract 8, we have a negative 10. All right, so let's go ahead and factor this now. So now we're going to factor this to an x. We need it to multiply to be 10, get a positive 3. It's kind of familiar. We just did that one. Okay. So x equals a negative 5 and x equals 2. All right, and then check both of those. And if you look at a positive 2 and I go back to the original problem, let's just look at this right here. If I put a 2 in right here, that's going to be 2 squared, which is 4. So 4 minus 4 is 0. So that is undefined. It's the same thing if I put it in right here where there is an x minus 2. If I put my answer 2 in right there, that's going to be undefined. So really this problem, this answer is not going to work, and the only solution is going to be a negative 5. And that's called an extraneous solution. All right, so you need to go back, and that's why you need to check your answers to be sure that they all work correctly. All right, we have one more problem here. I'm just going to flip this over to the back. So here is E. These are again from your study notes. So all right, it looks like there's one more. No, we're okay. So 24. All right, so here's the problem. So remember here, still trying to get this just to look a little bit better. I don't know. This maybe, there we go, it's a little bit better. So we always want to write the x squared first here, right? So if I write the x squared first, we kind of talked about that, then that's how I want to write that denominator. But I don't want to have a negative here, so I'm going to factor that negative out. So if I take a negative 1 out of there, that way we don't have a leading coefficient here. So we have, this would make it an x squared minus 9. All right, so now I've kind of taken one more step. Now, over here, this negative 1 can be shown anywhere. For example, if I have a problem, so what I'm left with on the right side is 24 over a negative 1 times x squared minus 9. So this negative 1 can be shown here or it can be shown up there. It doesn't matter. What's 24 divided by negative 1? Well, it's a negative 24. So I can rewrite that problem like that. And really all I did is either divide this or I just move this negative 1 multiplied by a negative 1, either way. So really this negative we're going to keep up here at the top so we don't have to deal with it down here when we're factoring and getting a common denominator. All right, so maybe I better, since I have, maybe I better go ahead and just rewrite this out. Equals a negative 24 over x squared minus 9. That simplified a much easier way. So now let's factor out. This is a difference of squares. So x plus 3 and x minus 3, and then we can cancel that out. All right, so what's our common denominator? Our common denominator is going to be, we have an x minus 3, we have an x plus 3, and we have the same here, so we don't have to worry about it. Okay. Okay, so see how we have a common denominator for all of these. All right, so what am I missing here? Well, I'm missing an x plus 3. So that means I need to multiply this times an x plus 3. So let's distribute 2x times x, and then 2x times 3. And then here, I'm missing an x minus 3. So I'm going to multiply, sorry, I got to squeeze that in there, x minus 3. And then we're going to multiply this times an x minus 3. So distribute the 4 through. So plus 4x minus 12 is going to equal, I have the common denominator over here, so I don't have to change it. So let's go ahead and just get rid of the denominator. Multiply both sides by x plus 3x minus 3, right? So these cancel out. So it's just the numerator. And let's go ahead and combine like terms. Plus 6 plus 4. And then we just have to figure out how to set that equal to 0 and factor it. So let's go ahead and set it equal to 0. That means we have to add 24 to both sides, right? Keep it balanced. So add 24, add 24. Now we can factor. But before we factor, remember, you always want to look for greatest common factor. Or once it's set equal to 0, I can just divide out that greatest common factor. So would you agree that I could divide this by 2, this by 2, and this by 2? So what we're left with then is an x squared plus 5x equals 0. All right, so here let's factor. So this is going to be multiplied to 6 equals 5. So how about a plus 3 and a plus 2? So set each of these equal to 0. X equals a negative 3. Set that equal to 0. X equals a negative 2. And check those, because I believe when you go back and check, this negative 3 does not work, because if I put a negative 3 right here, that is undefined. That becomes 0. So if it's undefined anywhere, that is not, and it would also be undefined here. So this will not work, so this would be your answer. But you also have to show that you check that negative 2 by putting it back into the original. All right. All right. How is that? I hope that's not, I hope you can read that. It looks a little, maybe use a pen or something different so you can see it a little bit better. But all right, I will get some 5.4 and 5.5 notes out for you the next day or two. So have a great day, guys. Thanks for tuning in.